Hello there everyone, I'm back with yet another Xilonen video, and in this video, I'm going to be telling you which characters are going to benefit the most from her release. It's been quite a while since our last universal support, being Furina, and when she came out, we got a lot of upgrades for a lot of characters. But obviously, some became better than others. So let's talk about the character Xilonen works with, and who is going to get the biggest upgrades out of her release. First of all, I would like to talk about the character that might be getting the largest upgrade out of any in the entire game, which is my main, Navia. Now, Navia is already a good character at base, and if you look at her from a baseline, she is already a very strong character. So why is she not among the big DPSs like Neuvillette or Linny? Well, it's because her team options are incredibly limited. Two of her slots have already been figured out, being Furina for elemental application, as well as a lot of damage bonus and just general buffing, and then Bennett for his massive attack percent buff, and also healing for Furina. It was always the fourth slot that caused problems, because first, we were stuck with Zhongli, a healer who did shred resistance but had like no damage of his own, and the resistance shred was pretty small. Then we got Chiori, a character who has an active anti-synergy with Navia, because Navia is one of the very few Geo characters that does not have a Geo construct, which means that Chiori's damage was heavily dampered in a Navia team. But now we are getting Xilonen, and while she does not apply any off-field Geo to generate more crystallizes, this is actually fine with a simple rotation change. So, what does Xilonen do for Navia? Well, first of all, she's Geo, so you get Geo Resonance, which is one of the strongest resonance in the game for the Geo characters, as well as a lot of Resistance Shred, which I know you're already getting from Geo Resonance, but it's still a nice extra amount. Xilonen will also be able to hold the 4-piece Cinder City set, which, considering the fact that Xilonen is Geo, will always buff Geo damage by 40%. This means that Navia gets a ridiculous damage increase from the introduction of Xilonen, because now she might be one of the biggest single-target behemoths in the game if Xilonen releases in her current state. And don't just take my word for it, look at the calculations. Like, it's such a big increase that I'm honestly floored that MiHoYo allowed this. But she's still not gonna be the best DPS in the game, not even the best single-target DPS in the game, because for some reason, they decided to have Xilonen buff Neuvillette as well. And it's a pretty big buff, because just like Navia, Neuvillette was stuck with a Zhongli, which means that this is going to be quite the upgrade. In Zhongli's defense, in a Neuvillette team, he is able to hold the 4-piece Archaic Petra set, which means he's able to buff Hydro damage by 35%, which is pretty useful. But Xilonen way outdoes him in a damage buffing department. Like I said before, she is going to be able to buff your damage percent by 40%, which is higher than Archaic Petra's 35%, and the Red Shred also goes up from 20% to 36%. The big issue that Xilonen does have with Neuvillette is that Zhongli allows Neuvillette to not get interrupted, whereas Xilonen doesn't really provide any sort of interruption resistance unless you have her at C1. So this means that Xilonen is a little less safe to play, but it is a pretty big damage increase. There's also a new Vape team for Neuvillette, which consists of Neuvillette, Xilonen, and then Xiangling and Kazuha or Sucrose, with Sucrose being for higher damage and Kazuha being for better grouping. Now, this is going to be a very strong single-target team, and even the regular Furina variant is going to be incredible in single-target. Another character that's being buffed by the release of Xilonen is going to be Linny. Now, Linny is currently one of the strongest single-target characters in the game, but Xilonen doesn't buff him as much as Xilonen buffs the previously two mentioned characters. So I would like to take Linny as an example of someone who is buffed by Xilonen, but not buffed to an extent to where it's as big as, for example, Navia. And the reason for this all comes down to supports. Navia and Nouvelette kind of had a pretty disappointing 4th slot when it comes to their supports. However, Linny already had a fully fledged team of Furina, Kazuha, and Bennett. All of these characters are incredibly strong, and there was no real reason to replace any of them. Now, Xilonen is an increase for Linny, as her uptime is better, and she's able to buff Furina better, which will lead to an overall DPS increase. But Kazuha's buffs are higher, which means for Linny specifically, you're going to see higher screenshots when using Kazuha. Xilonen's setups are also way easier to do, because you are able to get a Hydro Crystallize during the setup with her ultimate, and then you can get a Pyro Crystallize at the same point you would normally get a Pyro Swirl with Kazuha. So it really isn't that big of an upgrade, but it's still there. Now to talk about another character who is able to use Xilonen, and with this I'm talking about Arlino. Arlino is in a very similar spot to Linny, where she already had really strong supports, and didn't exactly need a different support. If we look at Arlino's personal damage output only, Xilonen is actually a DPS loss. This is because Kazuha has stronger buffing at a C0R0 level, and because Arlino is mainly a normal attack character, even at R1, Kazuha is able to do pretty well. But the reason that Xilonen is still an increase for this team is because her higher buff uptime leads to a lot higher Yelan damage. And Yelan's damage is significant enough in the team to where this increase warrants you being able to use Xilonen, and it even being very slightly better than using Kazuha. But really, it's not by much. So this goes to show that Xilonen is essentially usable with every character that is using Kazuha right now, but is specifically the best with the characters who either didn't really have a great 4th slot yet, or the ones that have very high damaging sub-DPS characters that didn't benefit enough from Kazuha's buffs. Now, for the final character I'm going to be discussing, I would like to talk about Itto. Now, Itto is a very interesting character, because when we were all first reading Xilonen's kit, we were thinking she was finally going to be the Geo healer that Itto's been asking for so long, just so he can use Furina, and then we all got slapped in the face. But Xilonen is still usable with Itto, just not to a great extent. You could go 2 ways when you have Xilonen-Itto combo. Either you can go the route of using Furina and Bennett, which means you have very little geoparticle generation, and Itto is quite famous for his energy issues, so you will not be bursting a lot on him, which overall will lead to a very low damage output even compared to the current team. The second idea is you can just slot in Xilonen instead of Zhongli. However, this also has its problems, because Xilonen is not able to use her biggest asset in this team, which is her resistance shred. This is because you need a minimum of 2 elemental infused crystals for her to be able to increase her Night Soul meter, and being able to increase her Night Soul meter is the way that you unlock her res shred. So at that point, Xilonen will just be a glorified sub-DPS. And while that is actually fine because Zhongli is not a good teammate, at that point, you might as well just play an on-field DPS Xilonen with Furina, Shen Yun, and Kachina. This is because that team would in fact have a higher DPS than an Itto, Chiori, Xilonen, and Goro team. So, no matter what way you look at it, using Itto and Xilonen together isn't actually as good of a combo as I thought in my original video, and I'm sorry for that. So, which team are you guys going to be using your Xilonen in? I know I'm going to be using her with my Navia to get some crazy speedruns, but I'm curious to know what you guys will do. let me know in the comments, and while you're there, leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and you might as well check out my other videos. So, that'll be all from me. Peace.